The Army Futures Command is leading the efforts to modernize the U.S. Army. Earlier this week, we spoke with Army General Mike Murray, who leads the Army Futures Command, at the AUSA annual meeting to discuss the latest initiatives from the command and lessons learned from past joint all-domain exercises. This conversation is part of our Army Modernization series. General Murray, welcome.
Thank you.
Nice to have you.
Thank you.
So, Army Futures Command was created in 2018.
Yep.
How have you done so far?
I'm a little biased, but I think, if you look at the start of Army Futures Command just a little over 3 years ago, so it was August 24th of 18 to be specific, when we uncased the colors, there were 10 of us standing there when the ceremony was over. And then, the size doesn't really matter, but, you get to an organization of over 27,000 people today. The intersection of technology concepts and organizational structures that we've kind of driven, and then some of the newer initiatives like Project Convergence, which I think we're going to talk about, the standing up of a software factory, the standing up of what we call the Army Applications Lab, to really begin to work with the non-traditional industry we had never worked with in the past. And operating as a headquarters. And so we were trying to grow the headquarters and complete the merger, if you will, of existing Army organizations in the course of 3 years. I think, as I step back and look at it, I think it's remarkable progress.
You mentioned Project Convergence. What is it? What are you trying to accomplish?
So Project Convergence was just an idea last year, and it was done on a shoestring because it was a last-minute idea. So you're very familiar with the PALM process. We weren't in the PALM, so we were wandering the halls with a tin cup looking for resources to do Project Convergence. It really started off as the Army's attempt to figure out how JAD C2, so Joint All-Domain Command and Control, applied to the Army. So we started off with a simple concept of trying to link sensors to shooters through C2 command and control nodes, headquarters. And we very quickly figured out that requires a lot of bandwidth, and so it's sensors to the right shooter and only through the appropriate C2. And that was last year, and we were successful linking sensors from space, from terrestrial, and from the air through some in-house developed artificial intelligence algorithms that helped us identify targets and then pick the best shooter and do it a lot faster than we can do it today. We quickly realized last year that the Army, we didn't realize, we knew, but we realized we need to bring the joint force in. So Project Convergence 21, we started last December with a 3-star board of directors and got all 5 of the services, to include the Space Force involved, plus the Missile Defense Agency, plus the intel community, to really focus on trying to solve the hardest, what we call use cases, so mission threads that the joint force is going to face in a future conflict. And that starts this week. So
what have you learned so far? And I know that you're just getting started.
Yeah.
What's the most important things you've been learning so far?
So it's really complex, that we have built for decades systems that weren't meant to talk to each other. If we could just throw everything away and start over with, but that's not going to happen, right? You're just not going to throw everything away that the U.S. government and really the taxpayers have invested in for the last decades. And so bringing legacy systems to the table, and how do you connect them? And it's about data. I mean, how do you give other services and other platforms access to the data they need to effectively operate in a what is undoubtedly going to be a contested environment? And so each week, this week for instance, we'll work through the use case, and then on Friday we'll deliberately make it hard on ourselves by taking away some of the capability by jamming and other things.
So I was going to ask you about electronic warfare,
yeah,
cybersecurity. I mean, you mentioned things coming from space and terrestrial systems. How do you deal with that?
So we figure out where we're vulnerable, and I would just say the network is, the network we're building out is going to be key to everything we're trying to do. You can have the best long-range shooter in the world, but if it can't access the data because the network's been denied, then that's all you have is a really neat capability. So it's figuring out where our vulnerabilities are, and then in the Army we call it a PACE plan, so figuring out alternative paths for that data to flow. And so a lot of the work we're doing this week, next week, and the next 2 weeks after that are figuring out, how does that data flow, and when certain paths are taken away from you, how can it be rerouted so you can make sure that you've got access to the data you need.
Then how do you take what you learned from Project Convergence? How does that inform the rest of your modernization efforts as a whole?
So it's, we've talked so far about technology. We'll also have the 82nd Airborne Division recently back from Afghanistan. And we'll have what we call the first multi-domain task force out of the Joint Base Lewis McChord in Washington State. So it is about the technology, but it's also about how that technology is going to force us to fight differently in the future. So the application of that technology should provide some operational benefit to a unit as they use it. So we'll learn about how we're going to fight in the future. We'll also learn about different structures. So the first multi-domain task force is a brand new unit and still figuring out their role in multi-domain operations. So, maybe we'll have to do some restructuring in terms of cyber capability, electronic warfare capability, long-range precision fires capability. So it is the technology, but really the technology is the driver, and then really two paths. One is it'll feed Project Convergence 22, because it is a campaign of learning. People call it a demonstration exercise. I mean, it's all that, but I prefer to think of it as a campaign of learning. But we just don't, nobody's paying me just to learn, right? So it's also what technologies can we spin out and get in the hands of our soldiers very, very quickly through the appropriate program manager.
So General Murray, we're talking about Futures Command, and I'm wondering how you're working with industry and how you would like to work with your industry partners.
So I think, and we were talking about Project Convergence before, I actually, and I would recommend you ask them as well, I think the communications with industry, when you're talking about the major defense industry partners, I think the communications got better. And I think we've done a better job of describing problems we're trying to solve as opposed to telling them exactly what it is we want them to build. So coming out of Project Convergence 20, we sat down with the CEOs from the defense primes in a small session, and then we opened it up to anybody that wanted to participate. We had 1,000 people on the net as we described the problems that we saw in Project Convergence 20. We did the same thing getting into 21. We'll do the same thing coming out of Project Convergence 21, and then as we get into Project Convergence 22, we'll drag in industry partners. The best way for industry to participate is through what we call CRADA, where they can bring their tech, and it's up at Aberdeen Proving Ground, a Joint Systems Integration Lab. And I have very clearly instilled in the people up at Aberdeen that this is best athlete. So if industry has a better solution than we do, then I'm happy with the industry solution. But if we've got a better solution, we can't scale things. So we're still going to need industry participation if we've got the right algorithm, for instance, that we're going to have to scale.
You said in our last segment about working with non-traditional companies. Yeah. How non-traditional are we talking about?
So we're talking everything from the startup working out of a garage to small business to some people that have dabbled. We're through the Army Applications Lab in Austin, we're probably about 85% non-traditional defense. And it's a very similar approach in terms of we tell them our problem we're trying to solve. And the example there is we want to be able to fire faster through our self-propelled howitzers, the artillery pieces that are self-propelled armored vehicles. And so the problem we described for them is not that we wanted an autoloader or that we needed these technical specifications. The problem we gave them is, and I won't say the actual numbers, we want to go from X rounds a minute to Y rounds a minute. Help us figure it out. And so they came up with some solutions I would have expected them to come up with, but they also came up with things that most people would say, duh. Right, so putting a QR code on an artillery round so you can scan it, and so that back at the ammunition supply point they know exactly where the ammunition is in the system. That is just like but it's just looking.
You can do that with an iPhone.
Yeah, but I know, but I've walked past that problem for 30 years and never even thought about that was a problem we could solve. And so it's everything from material solutions, technical solutions, to things, looking at our problems differently. And the most successful part of it is taking these small businesses, entrepreneurs to places like Fort Sill or Fort Hood and letting them spend the day seeing the problem. And they come back with all kinds of different ways of thinking about how to help us solve problems.
Well, what about acquisition? Because, We know that acquisition in DoD takes a long time, but you're dealing with really high-tech stuff that needs to get there quickly. It needs to get there, within cost, and the process still needs to be fair and transparent and all that kind of thing. So how are you doing that?
That's when I lean on the acquisition professionals that are our partners from day one. So the cross-functional teams, which we haven't talked about, they're all partnered with program executive officer and the associated PMs of the efforts they're working, some of them programs, some of them not yet programs. The partnership that I have with Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, Technology, ASALT, Bruce Jetty before, currently Karen Sanders is sitting in that position. And it's really, I think, the term cross-functional gets overused but underappreciated, and so from the very beginning of an effort or a program, making sure we have that ASALT partner, because I can't produce anything except good ideas. I have to have that partnership. The testing community involved from the very beginning, our labs, because that's where the technical expertise is, involved from the very beginning. Army Materiel Command, so logisticians, as we look at life cycle support for that piece of equipment. And so it's that cross-functional, really across the Army, is what allows you to accelerate.
I want to ask you about long-range hypersonic weapons. What's the Army's rationale for those weapons, and are they more appropriate for the Air Force?
I'll be a little parochial. I think there is enough need for hypersonic weapon, and really what's valuable about a hypersonic weapon is the range, the speed, and the difficulty of intercepting a hypersonic weapon. I think the more dilemmas we can create for an adversary, whoever that adversary is, that that threat could be coming from a land-based system, an air-breathing system, the Air Force, or from the sea, from a Navy system. I think when you allow an adversary to focus on only addressing one threat, I think you've taken away a lot of options for a joint force commander. So I think there's plenty of room for all the services in this arena.
What about directed energy? What's your strategy for that?
So I think directed energy has a lot of potential. And so we're working on a couple directed energy systems from an air and missile defense perspective. I think we still got a ways to go. They're still hugely expensive. And then there's little things like airspace clearance. And, unlike a kinetic weapon, when you're clearing airspace out to a certain distance, if you get a directed energy weapon of any magnitude, you got to clear the space catalog, right? And so, and that's all doable. But I think, how we integrate directed energy into, because I don't think you can just rely on just directed energy because of atmospherics and weather and other things. So it's a mix of kinetic and directed energy, kinetic energy and directed energy. How you pair those together, and then really we got to get the price point down, because right now, and we're just building prototypes, so they're expected to be expensive, but we got to get and then you balance a very expensive missile off a kinetic energy system versus a shot that costs you basically pennies. And so over time it becomes cheaper, but there's still a lot of work to do as we still prototype.
So finally, General, what are you trying to accomplish here at AUSA this week?
At AUSA this week is strengthening some industry partnerships, and so I'll spend a lot of time with booths. Seeing some people I haven't seen in a long time is obviously always a part of it. And then just telling the story of Army Futures Command, because I think it's an incredible story where we've come in 3 years, and I think there's a tremendous amount of work that still needs to be done, and just make sure people understand what it is we're trying to do.
And we're happy to be a part of that too. Thank you so much for being with us.
All right, good to see you.